Welcome back to the Hill of Roses, where we come once again to celebrate the best contributors to our united progressive movement. With me today, I have Roslyn Fuller. Roslyn is a leading authority on infusing the ancient ideals of Athenian democracy with the participatory potential of modern information technology. She was educated in Germany and Ireland with a PhD in international law from Trinity College, Dublin. Roslyn is the author of Beasts and Gods: How Democracy Changed Its Meaning and Lost Its Purpose, and In Defense of Democracy. Welcome to the program, Roslyn.
Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be able to talk to you today about your top three priorities. I think a lot of them are pretty much right in line with what mine are as well. The first one that you have is introducing a digital democracy. Digital direct democracy. The second of which is having a pay for participation using a universal basic income. And the third of which is laying the foundations for real democracy by reducing economic inequality. I wanted to start with your top priority, direct digital democracy. Rosalind, why did this become one of your top priorities?
When I was younger, I always suspected, there's something wrong with how we're doing democracy. And that was primarily because, I grew up, I was a teenager in the 90s, and one of the kind of watchwords back then was like the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. That was just something that you heard repeated again and again and again, as if it was something like a kind of God-given property that
Yeah.
the rich would get richer, the poor would get poorer. And as a person from a rural background, and I would say a middle class or lower middle class background, I would think, why is that? Why are we letting that happen in a democracy, right? Why would people inflict that upon themselves? So I always had this kind of suspicion that something's not quite right here. And then when I went to Germany, I studied law in Germany. And after that, I went to write my PhD, and I worked on how we could make international institutions more democratic.
Mm.
And in doing that, I began to look at, what is democracy? And what do we even mean by democracy? Lawyers would have a very legalistic answer to that. It means the freedom of speech. It means the right to protest, things like that. But that was kind of going in a circle for me. It didn't really get to the main point. And so I began to look into older forms of democracy, Athenian democracy, which was a very direct form of democracy, and an issue-based democracy. So where you vote on issues rather than on politicians. So where people make decisions directly, they don't delegate those major decisions to other people to decide. And I began to notice that this could be a way for democracy today to move forward, and that with digital technology, it would be possible to do that on a massive scale, unlike in previous decades and centuries.
Yeah, I strongly agree with you that technology has largely unlocked innovation that goes beyond just what's happening in our markets. It's also unlocking what we can do in how we are represented. I'm curious to hear why you believe a direct democracy is more important than something closer to a representative democracy.
Okay, so a representative democracy, when the United States, at the founding fathers of the United States, didn't create, they didn't intend to create a democracy. And that's something you'll see sometimes cropping up in Twitter conversations about democracy. You'll see, usually libertarians or conservatives will say, this isn't meant to be a democracy, this is a
Mm-hmm.
republic. And they're actually right about that. It was designed to be a republic. A republic is kind of a more, well, it's a society without a king, and it's where there is kind of a sort of basis of consent, but it's usually quite limited, often to people with property, like
Mm-hmm.
in the beginning, and maybe slowly expanded. And what we've done is we've kind of slowly expanded that republican system, which is very much about power sharing, right? You win power for 2 years or 4 years, depending on the circumstances or more in some countries, and you don't share that during that time. What that leads to is a lot of vote skewing.
Mm.
That is particularly the case in first past the post systems like the United States, where you can have situations where people who lose an election, so they actually lose the popular vote in the election, win the election. And that, of course, has most famously recently happened with Donald Trump, but it happened with George Bush as well. And it can always happen, in parliamentary systems like Canada or Britain. It's rare for the party who becomes the governing party to have actually won a majority of the
Yeah.
vote. So there's a lot of clarity about what votes mean. When you vote for a party, what does it mean? Does it mean that you endorse every part of that party platform? Or does it just mean that you agree with one particular aspect of it? Does it mean that you trust that politician more, even if you don't agree with a lot of their policies, that you trust that they're more capable than another politician? No one knows, right? There's different
Yeah.
reasons people vote for different people. So it's all actually quite complex. So we don't really know what votes mean, which means we don't really know what we're doing most of the time.
Yeah, no, I strongly agree with you there. I thought one point you made that was particularly apt is that largely when you have this republic, we become more focused on the occupation of office and holding power than the actual issues themselves. One problem I've seen that's been brought up, being that I'm also kind of an advocate for direct democracy, that I've had people bring up as criticism is, well, if you're going to have better results from spreading this power to its final point of all people's hands who are citizens of that country, don't you need an informed population to be making those decisions? How can we know we're making the right decisions for our country if we're not letting necessarily experts make those decisions?
Right. Okay. So first off, I would say right now experts often don't make the decisions.
Yeah,
So
that's true
that's
too.
it's kind of how much experts are involved in this is often quite overrated. You would think they would be, but we often, and I say it's not just an issue in the U.S. In other countries as well, we often have ministers who have no particular expertise in the area that they are supposed to be administering, right?
Hmm.
So it's probably a bit overrated how much experts are really involved in this to begin with. The second thing is, of course, experts do disagree sometimes, right? Like there is a limit to human knowledge. A lot of the time you're making predictions, you're making probable, guesses based on probability. So the idea that there are these kind of one right answers and that there's a real solid basis of knowledge is also exaggerated, right? There's disagreements among academics among what are the best ways to do things, right? A lot of the time, and other experts as well. So that you just kind of have to take to get used to that basis of that there is some uncertainty in life, right? The third thing is that it's a kind of a chicken and egg scenario, because I do agree that elections do tend to infantilize people, because it's very much about pounding slogans
Mm.
into people's heads again and again and again. The debate is often quite limited, and I think the debate in mainstream media is often very limited. Which you'll tend to see are 10,000 articles, 15,000 articles, 20,000 articles with the same information
Mm.
in it. You'd probably be better served to read less but have more information. 3 articles that were actually quite different and would add to your knowledge base would be more useful than 20,000 articles that just repeat each other. So we do have a situation where there's a lot of information that kind of isn't getting out. But what is the incentive for people to inform themselves? What is the incentive for information to kind of move forward in a somewhat linear fashion, at least, where you learn from your mistakes? I think the way to do that is to involve people in decision making so that they have the direct experience of that. And so that over time, that experience also accumulates, right? Like 10 years from now, you'll say, oh, I remember something like that 7 years ago, and so on and so forth. So I think people really like this idea that there would be a great point at which you could educate people. And after that, they would be educated enough to make decisions. But you learn by doing. You don't just learn things out of a book. You have to learn by doing. You have to apply your knowledge and learn from what happened when you applied your knowledge. And the only way to do that is to get more active hands on rather than just being able to blame everything on somebody else and have this situation of quite, lack of accountability like we have now.
Yeah, I strongly agree with you there. I think there's 2 points there that are really important. I think having a direct democracy incentivizes people to actually inform themselves. Rather than saying, oh, I'll just trust this person and they'll educate themselves, they have to do that themselves to make an informed decision. And by doing this, maybe you have some stumbles out the gate, but by doing this over time, you're educating the populace of what's going on in general. And I think the second point that was really aptly made is that when we have these representation models, you end up with these very hollow conversations, and it's focused on the person themselves. Just look at where we are in our American election. One of our candidates, Joe Biden, largely does not run on policy being his main bread and butter. You're trying to just buy Joe the person. And I think when we're trying to get stuff done for the people, I think we want to know what we're actually getting rather than just trusting a friendly face. One of the questions I have for you, though, is how do you actually execute something like this? For example, in the House of Representatives, there's a certain set number of people. We know where quorum is gathered. If you have a direct democracy, how do you know, like, how to frame that? Like, if you have a low turnout of people participating, is that a good result necessarily?
Yeah, that's interesting, and I mean we're really at the beginning of this funnel right now. So what we try to do a lot is support participatory budgeting, which is usually done on a municipal level, and other kind of digital democracy things that are also usually done on a congressional seat level. So what we try to encourage people to do is to listen to their constituents or vote in a way that their constituents say they could vote, right? Say they should vote. So those are quite small scale things, but we're not in a position of taking over countries. So,
Yes.
so that's where we are. In the long run, like how you're playing it out and saying, in the long run, how would that work? Well, in Ireland, where I live, for example, we have referendums,
Mm.
national referendums. And whenever we want to change the constitution in Ireland, we need to have a referendum to do that. So in the time I've lived here, I think we've averaged about one referendum a year in the time I've lived here. So sometimes it goes a few years without them, and then you have a few more. The participation rate, we don't have a limit on, we don't have a set of how many people need to vote in order for the referendum to be valid. So you have a referendum, it's your choice if you vote or not. You can't complain later if you don't like the result. Sometimes we get a pretty low turnout on those, but we still consider them to be valid because everybody was informed and everyone had the chance to participate. There will be things, I think, if we look forward and say, what would a democracy be like in the future, where you would often have the chance to vote in what would basically be a referendum on an issue. Um, I think you will end up with situations where sometimes people just aren't particularly interested in a particular topic. We had a referendum here on children's rights, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago now, which I didn't vote on because I wasn't interested in it. So even though I'm a very active political citizen, right? So I think you just have to accept that that happens, and that the key is kind of what is your chance to participate, that everyone does have a chance, that everyone does have a chance to vote, that everyone, that there is a big effort to have information about those things, but to accept that there will be times when some people, possibly even the majority of people, don't really care one way or the other about a particular issue, and that's okay.
Yeah, no, I think that does make sense given the opportunity. So would it be safe to say you'd be opposed to things like what exists in Australia, like conscription voting, where people are required to vote?
Yeah, I am. I don't think it's the greatest idea. I think that if you if you don't feel like you have an opinion on that point, that's fine. Leave it to someone else. I mean, there are all kinds of ways we do that in everyday life where we say, that's not my particular thing that I'm that focused on. I'm happy to leave that to other people who are more concerned with that particular area, right? Um, so I think that's actually quite acceptable for people to focus on things that they are interested in. Now, of course, you could run into issues where that gets extremely narrow, and you kind of get your single issue voters, if you
Yeah.
want. But I don't think that would be the broad majority of people. I think you'll always get a broad majority of people to focus on the core issues, especially like economics, education, the things that generally do come up in elections as main topics. Healthcare, those kind of things. I think you'll probably get most people to have an opinion on those.
Yeah, I think that begs the question though of like how are these things being presented to us? If it's a direct democracy, is it something where the people would start a petition and if it reaches a certain point, it would require a vote to be put to the floor? How do you see the actual proposals of things coming up?
Yeah, if I could just say one more thing too, as far as referendums are concerned, so what we get in Ireland, and what is quite normal is that the referendum question is formulated.
Mm.
So you have to decide if you're a yes or no on that point. And that I think does lead to sometimes, like for myself on the children's referendum, it's not that I don't have opinions on children or the welfare of
Yeah.
children. It's just that I didn't feel that my views were reflected by that question. And I think so that this is speaking to the point you just brought up, which is how are people involved in not just voting yes or no, but in actually determining what the question is in the first place. Um, and that's something that is pretty much not done too often in the world. In Switzerland, there is a mechanism by which people can petition to have a referendum, basically. And you have to collect it. So as you're describing, you have to collect a certain amount of signatures. For myself, now, this is not, for example, how things would have been done in ancient Athens, which was a very developed direct democracy. How things were done in ancient Athens was that there were also quite a lot of people, officials were selected by lottery.
Hmm.
Now, what's crucial about that is that they were selected in really big numbers, right? Like compared to the population. So it would be like having hundreds of thousands of people being selected to a particular body, or potentially millions of people today. And there was this one body in Athens that basically set the agenda then for what in Athens was called the assembly, which was where people went to debate and to vote. So basically, they took suggestions from citizens and they would put together an agenda of what seemed like the most important points or the most popular points. Sometimes they would formulate those into questions, but sometimes they were also quite open-ended discussion. So what is interesting about that is that it's like a really, really low barrier to getting your topic on the agenda, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily a low barrier to getting things decided in your favor, the way you would like them to be decided, but it's definitely a low barrier to getting them on the agenda. So those are two different ways of doing it. One is the petition way. One is the kind of more developed democracy, where you have these supporting administrative bodies that deal with those kind of things, but which have low barriers to getting things through. So they're both valid. What is not so great about petitions is that they do require sometimes a lot of resources
This is true.
to get the numbers up to do it. That being said, in an age of technology, that is significantly less than it once was.
Yeah, I was about to say that too. And I was curious, do you have a preference between the two models of having an admin and more developed kind of assembly model versus having a petition model?
Oh yeah, I'm definitely an advocate of the Athenian model,
Mm.
and the reason for that is that the Athenians had a very sophisticated direct democracy that was based on massive levels of participation compared to their citizen population. And so the key thing about the Athenian democracy is that it kind of kept people flowing from different places. So
Mm.
you could go and you participate in the assembly. You could put yourself into the lottery to be on this council, which you had a very high chance of being selected to be at some point in your life. You could put yourself forward as a juror, and juries at that time were huge as well. You could be an official in another capacity. So there were a few elected positions, but not as many as we would have today. So there were a lot of things you could do, and it kind of, because it kept people flowing, it really probably cut down quite a lot on corruption, for example.
Mm.
And it kind of kept up this thing of people being involved in decisions in a lot of different ways on a pretty nearly daily basis. So
Yeah,
democracy should be, in my view, like very, very active.
yeah, I tend to agree. Democracy does function best when it is very active, and I tend to agree that I would lean towards having some assembly rather than just having petition by petition deciding. I think we do
Like the
need
thing
some.
with the assembly. Sorry to interrupt. I should say with the assembly, just to be clear, like this was an ad hoc body, so it wasn't like you were selected to be part of this assembly on an ongoing basis. It was just a meeting that happened sometimes every month, sometimes every week, depending on the stage of history you're talking about. But like it was just if you want to go, you just show up. So
Mm.
there wasn't like something where you would be allowed to be a member and I wouldn't be, or we'd have to take turns or something like that.
Oh, okay. So it's kind of like a community town hall. And in this case, if you wanted to scale it up to a whole nation, it would be a whole nation's virtual town hall, potentially.
Exactly.
So I think that makes a lot of sense. The last thing I wanted to ask you on this subject before we get into your number two and number three priorities is how can people get involved in this type of advocacy?
Okay, well, there is actually participatory budgeting in some cities in the United States, so particularly in New York and Chicago. So I definitely encourage people there to get involved with those projects, or see if you can't set it up in your city. So participatory budgeting, it's like a sub form of direct democracy. It's where you decide on how the money should be spent in your community, basically. And that sounds kind of small scale, but of course, in cities, that can be quite a lot of money, actually. So, and quite significant. So, I would encourage people to start doing that in the city that you live in or town that you live in, because that's really a good way to start and to start, getting people aware of these processes and using them, and it's something that's very easy to do digitally as well, and there's all kinds of cities around the world that do it digitally, like Paris, Reykjavik, and even here in Dublin, part of Dublin does it digitally as well.
Yeah, I agree with that approach. I think everything's got to start local, and we need to start developing some pilot programs to be able to roll that out to a national level. So I'm really glad that we got to talk through that digital democracy. I look forward to being able to talk about what we're going to hopefully achieve with that digital democracy, which is hopefully reducing some of this economic inequality and actually paying for participation. So, Rosebuds, we'll be right back in part two, where we're going to discuss universal basic income.